all have received emails from me. I'm the program chair of the SAP interest group this year, and it's my great honor to introduce the keynote of this year. It's an absolute highlight because we have Richard Whittington, who founded the field of strategy as practice quite a number of years ago. And he's also been a founder of the Strategy as Practice interest group at the Academy of Management. And so it's with great delight that we have Richard here with us today. Also because he continues to challenge our work and bring in new ideas. But I will leave the introduction of Richard to our discussant, Dan Simpson. We deliberately invited somebody who has also worked quite extensively on the practice side in order to make this connection between academia and practice. And so I'm delighted to have both Dan and Richard here. And just a quick note to remind everybody, this is supposed to be an interactive session, and Richard likes it when it's interactive. So please go to the main AOM window with the session and go to the chat function where you can then post comments, questions, etc. So we try to make it as interactive as possible. So with that, I hand over to Dan to introduce himself and Richard.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Greetings from the San Francisco Bay Area. We kind of wish we were in Vancouver at the moment, but we are here in our various homes. I think you're probably familiar with Richard. This is his textbook, which is a fabulous textbook. I've been informed, however, I have the 11th edition. I'm informed I'm far out of date. There is a 12th edition available. It's even for practitioners like me. It's a great resource. And Richard's most recent book is Opening Strategy, published last year, and some of the content from this book will be part of his presentation. I got to know Richard, so I'm currently on the faculty at Berkeley Haas as a lecturer teaching strategy. I spent 34 years at the Clorox Company, which is a $6.5 billion consumer packaged goods company in the San Francisco Bay Area. Mostly a US company, it's about 80% US. Not any real business in Europe for those of you from Europe. And I became head of strategy there in 1989. Then a couple of years later, I was in London visiting Royal Dutch Shell to learn about scenario planning. And I walked through Waterstones, or one of the bookstores, and I came across this book. What is strategy and does it matter? Which I thought, well, I better read this, because if the answer is it doesn't matter, I need to find a new career. And that introduced me to Richard Whittington. So I thought it was a great book. And so I looked him up because he at the time was at Warwick, which is about 90 minutes north of London. So I took a train up to Warwick and we met, and this is 1993. So this book was first published in 1993. I learned today it's actually his second book. His first book was actually something about strategy in a recession, which I highly encourage him to republish right now. But I thought this was a fantastic book. So that was my introduction to Richard, and I've been keeping track of his work, etc., even in my remaining years as a chief strategy officer. So I was the chief strategy officer at Clorox for about 15 years, and then I worked for the CEO as kind of his chief of staff after that. Retired in 2013, and then joined the faculty at UC Berkeley. So Richard and I have known each other for like 27 years, as scary as that is. I have learned—
You're embarrassing us now.
Yes, well, yes, because the gray hair it's getting long now as well. But we learned from each other along the way. I have been a practitioner for a long time. Richard's been an academic for a long time. He knows lots of things I don't know. I may know a couple of things that he hasn't necessarily been experienced with. So it's we enjoy it when we get together and when we exchange ideas, because we come at the same subject from two very different perspectives. And so with that and my perspectives, so I'm part of the practitioner side, so I'm especially interested in this. And with that, I will turn it over to Richard for the keynote, and we will have our discussions along the way. And please join this. So please put questions in the chat, and it's all just kind of one big group here. Richard.
Thank you very much, Dan. It's been a long time, but a very nice, continuous set of conversations we've had over those, oh gosh, 30 years or so, roughly. It's absolutely wonderful. And I must admit, when you arrived at Warwick, you almost came from outer space for me, because I barely knew what Clorox was, and I had no idea that my book was being distributed in the US. And as an academic, at that point, I had very few pretensions to influencing practice or having anything to say very much to practice. And it's possibly engaging with you and people like you, which drew me into what became the strategy as practice field. Strategy as practice as a field had a number of founders. I'm definitely going to mention Jerry Johnson, co-author of that textbook actually, and Leif Melin as well as founders initially, but also people for the Academy of Management, people like Julia Balogun and Paula Jarvis-Sikowski, extremely important figures early on, and still are. So that's great. I think the next generations, people like Katerina, have really helped take the interest group at the Academy of Management further than ever before. And it's been wonderful to see what's been happening. Thanks, Katerina, for doing all this organizing in the most difficult circumstances. I can't imagine anything harder. So look, I posted something on the chat, and let's see whether I can get this to work. I would like, ideally, if I can get this to move on. How do I do that? Yeah. Katerina said, please post things to the chat. It'll be much more interesting than just listening to me. So there's the round circle. That's your target. Put some chat in. Katerina is going to collect some comments. I'm hoping to break 10 minutes, quarter of an hour from now. And then Dan may have some comments. Katerina may chuck some things in. But I hope above all that we'll have some things to interact over coming from you remotely, wherever you are. You might be anywhere in the world. So that would be great if you could do that. So I'm going to move to the next slide and just mention one thing. I've talked about here what I call strategy with a capital S. And you're no longer sharing screen, I think. What I mean by strategy with a capital S is it's time to think about strategy as a field of practice. And that field includes my work originally with Paula Jarzik-Koski, Linda Rouleau and colleagues. We did a paper way back in 2003 when we thought about strategy as a field for the first time. And that's work which has interested me ever since. So we have investors in there, we have consultants, we have the business media, we have regulators involved in the field, all shaping strategy, and we have business schools in the field. So what I want to do with that is point to the fact that we do have an important, okay, Katerina, yeah, this is just a little, I don't want to concentrate too much on the slides. I want to say that we are something more than an activity that goes on in organizations. Strategizing is only the beginning. Strategy with a capital S refers to a field which extends far beyond particular organizations. And strategy as practice needs to keep an eye on that. Katerina, you seize control of the slides now. Go on, move on to the next one. And so what this implies for me is three things. I'm not absolutely sure we need the slides here, but strategy as practice then has to be about the macro as well as the micro. We're to do with strategizing, hang on, but also to do with a macro field of strategy, how it's organized, whether it's working well, whether it's serving society and businesses and other organizations appropriately, as well as whether particular strategizing episodes are effective, whether particular strategy practitioners are getting what they want out of a strategy episode, and so on and so forth. So one of my arguments then is that SAP is a macro practice, And as such, it's about pervasive practices, practices which stretch across the world. And some of these are analytical practices, such as obviously, you know, Porter's 5 forces, or disruptive innovation, or blue ocean strategy, things like that. The discursive strategy, the way we talk about discursive practices, the way we talk about strategy, which involves some of this rhetoric of value and competition. And the technological practices, now more than ever, digital practices, which a number of people are working on a lot at the moment, digital strategizing. And these practices are very pervasive. They stretch across the world increasingly now. As such, then, I think that SAP has societal responsibilities, which are important for us to grasp. We are concerned with practices which make a difference to the way in which organizations behave across the world. And some of these organizations are very powerful. Just to think about the strategizing of a Google, or a Facebook, or of a Zoom, or a Microsoft, that has enormous implications across the world. Implications that governments are grasping just at the moment. Whether we agree with Donald Trump or not, he is seeing in TikTok something which has societal importance, and something that he feels the need to control in a particular way, which we could debate. Now, if strategy is a macro phenomenon, strategy is a field, strategy is something with a capital S, as well as strategy for a particular organization with a small s. I think there are 3 things that strategy shares. I just used 3 E's to describe them. Strategy as a field has traditionally been rather elitist. Strategy is seen as the preserve of top management. Prestigious consulting firms such as BCG or McKinsey and Bain and things like that. And often the ideas which shape the field and are disseminated particularly come from elite business schools, top business schools. Obviously your Harvards, which is responsible for everything from Chandler to Porter to Christensen, having an enormous influence over the world. But elite business schools have been widely influential and have certain responsibilities here. So strategy as a field is elitist. It tends to be economistic, that is, until recently certainly, prioritize profit or some sort of nice phrase such as value creation. It tends to see strategy as, in a default way, about competition. You think of Porter's 2 generic strategies. You're either price competitive or competitive through differentiation. And it tends again to think about markets. The non-market strategy has become increasingly important. Something that Facebook, Google, or indeed TikTok have to deal with every day nowadays. And I think it tends to be ethnocentric. The United States has been taken as the default model. After all, that's where all the knowledge has come from. And Harvard Business School, if you like, invented strategy sometime in the 1960s and has continued to offer its models and its teaching as something that the world should follow. Now, I think that's enormously problematic, all those things. But we know now that knowledge is not only held, valuable knowledge is not only held by an organizational elite. We know too that we operate in non-market environments, that firms have impacts which go way beyond just profit, have impacts upon some of the societal grand challenges, and that firms also, businesses also, operate not just in competition, but also in collaboration with each other. And finally, we know too that the United States is no longer the dominant economic power. It is just one, but an important one economy amongst very many. And as we look around the world, we see very, very different ways of doing strategy and thinking about what strategy is for. So obviously the rise of China or maybe of India and the African economies, they have different views of how strategy might be done. And we need, as strategies practice researchers perhaps, to grapple with this difference and no longer taking the United States as the default model. So strategy then, and this is where I'd like to hand over to Dan and Katerina and possibly others. I don't know what sort of comments are coming through. Katerina has got them. So here I want to be clear about the traditional elitism of the strategy field implies an important failing lacuna, and that is the stakeholders, employees, communities, supply chains, and the state indeed, have not got a sufficient voice in strategic decisions. One of the challenges then for strategy as practice, and here I refer to a notion of open strategy, which was in the book that Dan kindly flourished a few minutes ago. I think open strategy is one of the ways to include key stakeholders more. I think we need to move away from the economism to take much more, pay much more attention to non-market factors, so the role of the state in particular. Alphabet now is the biggest spending on corporate lobbying in Washington. Now that may or may not be a good thing, but it certainly suggests that Alphabet, Google's owner, sees the state and non-market factors as crucial to its strategy. Mark Zuckerberg is learning that when he's come under a lot of pressure and shareholder unrest and employee unrest over his policies on not tagging President Trump's statements for their accuracy or otherwise. And this inner ethnocentricity, I think, will blinds us to new sources of innovation in the field and challenge. We have new concepts coming out from the Chinese economy. We have the yin-yang concepts, which are being beginning to be researched in the strategist practice community. We have notions of Ubuntu or frugal innovation and things like that coming from outside the United States. So in my view, then, it's time now that strategy as practice should widen its purview to include, as far as possible, actors outside top management. And we've begun already to make a lot of progress on that with research on middle managers and in open strategy. To think about interactions with the non-market elements of the firm environment, social movements, states, and other regulators perhaps. And we need also to think about doing research from outside purely the Anglosphere, perhaps particularly, that is perhaps the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and extending that a little bit, than the advanced economies of the Northern Hemisphere. There's a lot more going on, and we need to study that from a strategist practice perspective. I think there I can finish for the initial introduction. Dan, Katerina, I don't know whether that is a good point for you, and whether we've had any comments or whether Dan and Katerina want to start us off. I haven't been able to follow all the comments.
Dan, do you want to start? I mean, there are a couple of questions in the chat, which I'm happy to pose, but maybe I'll let you go first.
Yeah, no, just go ahead and start with the chat questions, because a good portion of my comments, my discussion will probably occur after Richard's done kind of the second half, and we can talk about, because there's a kind of a problem and a solution, and that's when we can, I think that's when we'll have our most productive dialogue.
Okay. So Richard, in the chat there were already a couple of questions, and one relates around the relationship between the macro and the micro. Vikas asked that, I mean, initially your work on strategy as practice was placing SAP into the micro context, right? And now you're saying, okay, we need to see strategy as a macro phenomenon. And so he wanted to know about I guess, the relationship between micro and macro. And then also, I think related to that, Desiree was asking about how is the interplay between open strategy as an, I guess, entity kind of way, and then open strategizing practices. And I think this is a similar kind of question, so maybe you can elaborate on that.
Okay, yeah, and I think, yeah, Katerina, I think you noticed a relationship between the two kinds of question. So the relationship between micro and macro. When we started, we were fascinated by what was the activity that was going on in a particular boardroom or a away day a strategy meeting of sorts. And that was enormously revelatory. And we gathered a lot of wisdom, practical wisdom about how to manage strategy meetings, strategy processes from that kind of close observation. But the more one observes, the more one notices commonalities, certain practices. So if you talk about a strategy away day, that's a fairly, might be called a strategy retreat, but there are certain kinds of commonality across many, many different organizations, many, many different episodes. And if you think about the way in which strategies are communicated via PowerPoint or rationalized via Excel, again, you're using practices which are very common across many, many organizations. So as we learnt more, we began to realize that we're dealing with a general phenomenon. And Erovara and I wrote a paper back in 2012 where we said basically strategy as practice is, like it says on the label, about practices. Practices which are general, particularly. That's where the most purchase comes. In our teaching and in our research, we gain power through generalizability. So the idiosyncrasies of a particular strategy away day become more powerfully, more valuable if we can generalize from them. And as we look more at practices, I think we move to a more macro scale where, hang on, where do these practices come from? They come from technology firms, consulting firms, and business schools, and they're used very widely. Now, the micro element still remains important, it's connected to the macro, because each time a macro practice is employed, it's done differently in that particular micro instance, but it's still recognizably the same practice. And so I think strategy as practice, as we've learned, has moved towards a more macro perspective. In the book, for instance, I'm looking at the way in which strategy practices have developed over 60 years of time, since the early 1960s, and spread across the whole world, being used in Japan, Europe, as well as the United States, and more widely than that. So we can think about strategy as a macro institution with practices which disseminate across the whole world. And that's why we have a responsibility as part of that institution. We're responsible for the practices that we research, teach, develop, disseminate in various ways. So I think there is a connection between the micro and the macro, always, but the macro is possibly becoming more prominent now than it was originally in the first generation strategies practice research. One of the macro practices, this gets to Lisa's point, that I'm arguing is becoming more important, or a set of practices, is around open strategy. And there we have consulting firms, we have technology firms offering tools, social media tools, for doing strategy in a more open, participative fashion. Now, these tools are being pushed by particular organizations across the world with great effect and often considerable benefits. And on the whole, I'd regard those as a good thing. But they've become a macro practice because so many organizations are adopting them. And because so many organizations are adopting them, we need to give them scrutiny, careful, maybe sometimes critical scrutiny, to just understand their effects and some of which will be unintended and maybe unfortunate as well. So Lisa, I hope I'm able to tie those two things together. Open strategy is a kind of macro practice which has developed over the last 20 years with pervasive effects across the whole world. Okay, Katerina, I don't know whether that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Richard. And maybe one more question, and then we'll see how. There are a couple of questions who are actually already leading to your second part around the solution, so I'm gonna ask them a little bit later. But one question I think from Jeannie, which was very good. I hope I'm interpreting it right. She said, okay, you're pointing out the dark side of strategy practices, so the failings. And then she's asking this question, so how can we research that? And do we need to go beyond CSR and more an understanding of the relationship between political institution and the broader political economy and firm strategizing. So I guess it's a broader question. So then do you see that there's a need around changing the way in which we research strategy as practice?
Yeah, well, there's two steps in that. I'm not sure I'm emphasizing the dark side so much as saying there can be unintended consequences, unfortunate consequences. On the whole, the way I would see strategy developing as a field over the last 60 years, since the early 1960s, when it began to emerge, I see that as a positive development. If you think about how firm decisions were made, perhaps in the beginning of the 1960s, the decisions were made unaccountably by an entrepreneur or firm owner, and intuitively with little sense of rationale. And enormous assets were being deployed almost at a whim, with very little explanation to the world. If you look at the way corporations have to, and they do, explain their decisions now, both internally and externally, they do it much more comprehensively, with much greater sense of accountability than they did before. Now, there are some exceptions, perhaps in some parts of the world, and perhaps in Californian high tech. There's not full accountability by any means, but there has been generally a trend towards more openness. That if I were to summarize the last 60 years, there's more openness, and that's by and large a good thing. The enormous resources of these organizations are being deployed in a way that we can understand much better and challenge much better. So on the whole, it's good, but how would we research this? There's a little bit of a panel, there's a panel earlier this afternoon on the strategy division, which began to approach some of the research implications of the current situation. One of the things which seems very striking is that the old ways of doing strategy research are certainly in question. The most important corporations in the world, if you like, the Facebooks and the Alphabets, don't belong to competitive industries in the same way as they might have 60 years, or large firms might have 40 or 50 years ago. They are quasi-monopolistic. So to understand the differences in firm performance, heterogeneity in performance, which is the classic strategy question, is for those sorts of firms where an awful lot of contemporary value is concentrated, almost irrelevant. They are the industry. There are no comparators to see whether it's better performance or worse. It's very difficult to do that. They're quasi-monopolies. So the old ways of doing research and strategy are under challenge simply because they don't have sample sizes anymore. And also we have doubts about the dependent variable. Is it profit? Well, is monopolistic profit a good thing? Is that what we're trying to encourage, or should we be looking at other dependent variables? I think all those sorts of things are now in play within the conventional strategy field. For strategy as practice researchers, I think we do have a responsibility, and this perhaps comes to some of our later conversation. I think the first thing to do is to recognize the enormous diversity of firms we have around the world, which are not North American tech giants or North American corporations in the traditional sense. So we can begin to understand what drives them, what motivates them, what is value for them. And for a family group, value is not just simply profit, financial performance, but might involve longevity, continuity of the family, and its control, or even some sort of tradition of valuable, authentic products, which goes beyond simple financial performance. So I think we can, with a sociological eye, that is, strategy as practice eye, look at different kinds of firms. We need to go inside, I think, to understand the decisions that are made. I don't think strategy as practice has been so good at understanding motive as at understanding behavior. So what we often do is we observe very closely, going back to the micro, how managers are behaving and how they're achieving what they're doing. But I don't think we think very much about what motivates them. And again, going back to the family firm, perhaps the motive shouldn't simply be assumed in the old way the strategy is about performance maximization, but we ought to delve a bit deeper and understand these family businesses or other kinds of organizations in a deeper way, taking their motives as the criterion for judgment of effectiveness, rather than some external metric automatically assumed to be financial performance. So we ought to dig deep into these organizations as practice researchers to understand motive better in a more sophisticated, perhaps more discriminating way than we have done so far. I think I should stop there for a minute, but Katerina or Dan, you might, or indeed whoever's on the chat, might want me to elaborate on aspects of that or move on to another topic.
I'm just wondering, in the interest of time, should we maybe move on? There are a couple of things on the chat that I will pick up, but maybe it's better to have your second part of the presentation, that we make sure.
Which is short, which is not very much. So do you want to put on that last slide?
Sure.
Last slide.
Yep. Coming. It's slow. My laptop is slow, so sorry.
Oh, okay, and it's going over. Yeah. Yeah.
There we go.
So I've suggested that there are some ills with the strategy field. It's elitist, it's economistic, and it's rather ethnocentric. And this to a certain extent touches on some of the points I've made already. So I don't want to linger on this. But here's the first thing, I suppose. I drew a picture of a field of strategy which Paula Jarzakowski, Linda Rillo, Michael Meyer, Eleanor Muno, and Janine Nahapiat, we all worked on this paper way back in 2003. We suggested there was just one field. But actually the field of strategy in practice varies enormously between societies. And we would now want to include a much wider range of stakeholders in that field of strategy. And I think there are stakeholders who are demanding a say in a very different way. I'm working on a paper at the moment with Bashak Yakis Douglas, and we are thinking about the way movements within Google, within Facebook, within Amazon of employees are organizing themselves using digital media internally, but also traditional methods, or more or less traditional methods, protests and walkouts in the streets, to demand a voice on the strategy of their employers. So for instance, Meredith Whittaker has led over a long period of time and has now left Google, but within Google, she challenged the artificial intelligence strategy of Google, using her expertise, internal expertise, to say this strategy doesn't smell right. And eventually she was maneuvered out of the company. But at one point she helped get 20,000 Google employees out on a walkout. And that's interesting. So what's happening is a broader range of stakeholders is getting involved in strategy. Employees at a low level, a kind of insurgent form of openness, a spontaneous form of openness, where employees actually were allying with external social movements to demand a voice in shaping the strategy of Google towards artificial intelligence. So Bashak Yakis Douglas and I have been working on that. And we need then to think about a broader range of stakeholders, especially as we think about societal grand challenges or sustainable development goals. We need to bring those stakeholders in. We need to balance the economism with SAP's sociological lens. So the economism will typically assume profit, value creation, or something like that as the goal, the criterion by which strategies are judged. I think a more sociological lens would recognize there's difference about that. And I think we need to do more comparative research outside the standard context. Now that could be, and this is done already, and this is one of the strengths of the strategy as practice field. A lot of work is done in public sector organizations and pluralistic organizations of many sorts. I think in particular the work that Anne Langley over the years has done, and many of her colleagues, both within HSA, Montreal and elsewhere, they've done a lot of work on that, and I think that's important. But where I don't think we've done enough is comparative research between different societies. One exception to that, which I'll mention, is Shamin Bashanthan's work on Chinese strategy and strategizing, where the yin-yang principle, so far as I understand it, features a very different approach to doing strategy work to that of the more Cartesian, rational rationality of the Western intellectual and philosophical tradition. So I think we could do more comparative work between radically different contexts. So we've thought about China, that strategy field in the oval I've driven over there, is going to be very different. There's no long history of McKinsey and BCG and Bain within China preaching strategy ideas. There's no long history of business schools preaching strategy ideas. Investors might well be the state, or they might be members of interlinked networks who are not simply the detached investors of the North American model of at least the 1980s and 1990s, though that model has of course moved quite radically since then. So, and the business media is different too. So in a very, very different context, institutional context, we can expect a philosophical context, the sort of thing that Shamin Bashanthan talks about. We must expect the practice of strategy to be very different. I'm not very familiar with these things, but the kinds of frugal innovation which have been worked on in India, or the Ubuntu idea of working in Southern Africa, these again suggest very, very different approaches to strategy work. And I think if we can understand these contexts more thoroughly, we'll move away from the ethnocentrism that the strategy field as a whole has tended to suffer from. I have become, as a teacher, more and more sensitive to the difficulties of me teaching in Oxford in the United Kingdom groups of people who come from very, very different cultures. And I'm increasingly embarrassed about that. At the moment, I lack the research to thoroughly, systematically address the differences in strategizing practice across these different cultures. At the moment, I'm in acute danger of either apologizing for my implicit ethnocentrism and not having very much to say in response to challenges which sometimes come and increasingly come from executives and students who don't come from my particular culture. So I think that's something we really need to do. So those are some remedies to the three ills, I think, of elitism, economism, and ethnocentrism. I'm sure there's more that can be done. Something must be done, something quite substantial. That's the end of my remedies for now.
Richard, let me take the three points individually, because I have some different views and some different perspective necessarily. So on the elitist side, it strikes me it's if I compare over my 30 years in the field, it's dramatically better. Even relative to the late 80s when I became the chief strategy officer, for a couple of reasons. One is, like, even office buildings are changing. I mean, when I joined the company, the executive floor was on the very top floor, and you had to go through a guard and everything else to get there. And just even inside the company that I worked for, it's a much more open environment than it was years ago. I think that helps a lot. There's no question technology is changing. It makes communication much easier. The downside is that you get overwhelmed. I worked with Gary Hamel a bit, and we tried to do some work and involved lots of people in strategy development process. And the development process was challenging because at some point you get so much input, it's hard to wrestle that to the ground. But technology is an amazing ability to change the elitist kind of participation. It's not clear to me how Zoom is going to affect that. I mean, now that we're all working from home, is that a better thing or a worse thing? And I have two views on it. One is like, all right, it's better because it's like nobody's advantaged or disadvantaged. Like nobody's got direct connections, and so we're all doing that along the way, and that's a good thing. I mean, this call or this conference is, you can participate from anywhere in the world on a moment's notice, and that's a wonderful thing. So that technology works great. On the other side, you have to kind of set up a meeting, some kind of forum to meet. See, what you lose is like the casual conversations in the hallways, the kind of water cooler conversations, and even our executives, and I would do the same thing. When I was working, you go down at lunchtime and just sit in the lobby, just stand there and talk to people as they go by. You just learn a lot of stuff kind of walking around the halls. And it's like, how does that happen in a Zoom environment? I mean, in a COVID kind of environment. So I'm not sure. So what do you think? Do you agree or disagree the trend is getting better? And what do you think about the impact of our current environment on as a disrupting factor for this the elitist kind of a thing?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that yes, strategy is in some sense better than it ever has been, both technically and I think in terms of the sense of accountability and participation which is available. And technology is part of that, but I think there are changes in the nature of organizations which are intermingled with technology, but organizations themselves, their external and internal boundaries have worn away for all sorts of reasons. And I think contemporary culture has changed. There's a culture maybe superficial that is more egalitarian, but at the same time, there are certainly many, many more people. And business schools, somebody asked the question about, do business schools have a role? Business schools have had a definite positive role in that they've informed a larger and larger proportion of employees about the discourse of strategy, giving them confidence to participate. Now, still a small part, but there has been, in that sense, a democratization of the discourse of strategy, and that's all good things. I'm not going to reduce it just to technology, though I am saying something's changed about organizations and about the culture. The present crisis, there's certainly a huge research opportunity, and I said this earlier today as another occasion, that strategy as practice is challenged. The notion of a practice suggests repetition, routine. But what we've discovered in the last 3 or 4 months is that organizations can throw away their routines and practices, apparently, very easily, and adopt whole new ways of working, whole new strategies, whole new business models, remarkably quicker than we ever thought. I don't know whether we'll go back to the same, but even if we do go back to the old practices, we will always retain the knowledge that we can change them. So I think there will be a radical, fundamental shift in thinking about the practices and routines organizations have. We're no longer trapped by them. We are much more masters of them. And that, whatever COVID turns out to be, whether it's a year phenomenon or longer, we will know there's a conditionality, a provisionality to routines and practices that we didn't have quite before. So we do have the power to change. I think that's an enormously good thing. I'm very happy to respond to some other questions too, Katrina or Dan. Katrina, I don't know whether you've got, so there's some very big questions here. We're all in a water cooler conversation now, and I don't think Zoom, by the way, is a fantastic ethnographic opportunity for us. the movement wholly to digital strategizing will provide us with records that we can investigate for a long time and mine, and we will learn a lot about strategy in this digital environment. So in that sense, strategy as practice has got a great opportunity, simply empirically, because the records are going to be so much better.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Maybe if I've picked out 2 questions that I would like to ask, but then also feel free to jump in from the chat. So one question is from Gerard Hodgkinson, and then also backed up by Soterius and Verpi. And he was asking, so what are the implications of strategy as practice for our own sector, so for business schools and higher education? And how does this relate to the responsibility that you pointed out earlier, especially in terms of crisis like COVID-19, or also even in the US, in terms of the growing polarization around politics? Yeah.
Okay, so I started by saying that business schools are part of the field of strategy. We're implicated, we have a responsibility. I think we do some great things, like the education in strategy and business of a larger and larger proportion of people. Some people regret the fact that some enormous proportion of undergraduates in the United States, is it something like 30 or 40%, do a business studies degree? In many ways, as well as providing employment to us, this is a great thing because it does give a large part of society a fluency with the language of business, one of the most important institutions in their society. So in a sense, business school education is a form of civic education. If we want to understand our societies, we have to understand one of the dominant institutions of that society, and that's business. So we participate in that. We ought, and I think we are, I think most business schools are beginning slowly to move to a much more pluralistic approach of what business is for. We can no longer surely preach that the only purpose of a corporation is value creation, when all the value is being sucked up by those ginormous vacuum cleaners, Amazon, Alphabet, and Facebook. This cannot be a good thing. Returning to what Dan was saying earlier, one thing with the COVID crisis has taught us that our whole societies depend upon a handful of companies. Zoom is our latest arrival, but Microsoft, Google, and Facebook. These now are public utilities. They are essential to our societies. We need to think of them as about more than just value creation, value in heavy, inverted commas, and think about how we can control and organize those so they can serve society better. At the moment, they are owned and controlled by a handful, and really just a handful of extremely wealthy men, and yet not with much grey hair either. These are fairly unaccountable, dangerous, potentially youngish men who can make important decisions. We have ramifications throughout. So the business schools, I think, need to teach more about the social responsibility of business. Yes, but not in the banal sense, no, not the banal sense, not in the ordinary sense of not doing harm to society, but also thinking about how we can make business responsible to us. So I often say the societal grand challenges, they are health, they are inequality, they are around gender and things like that. But what the societal grand challenge which is most close to us is the control of large organizations. That's what we know about. That's our most proper concern. And so we ought to think about, in the business schools, responding to Gerard still, I think, about how we can make these large organizations more accountable to society.
Thank you. And a question that actually picks up directly on what you just said and was also asked in the chat was around, so strategy is typically shaped between the managers in the organization and the employees, etc. So how can we as scholars then shape this process of strategizing and strategy? And if I may add to this, because I know there are a couple of early career scholars in the session here as well, do you have any specific recommendations for early careers, what they can do to at least start on this path of shaping practice? And maybe that's a question that also Dan can respond to from the practitioner's point of view.
Yeah, I think I'd certainly respect Dan. He has a great deal of authority and experience, because Dan's always worked with business schools, and in that respect, I think is quite unusual, and that's great. So one of the things we often beat our breasts for in the business school world is we don't have much influence. Yeah, the economists seem to get on the telly programs and say, our forecast for next year is plus 2% or minus 2% or recently minus 20%. And we don't get quite the same exposure. But one of the things which is very noticeable, compared to any other social science or indeed any other department within most universities, is you do not get 30-year-old politicians coming to the politics department to do a 1-year or 2-year masters in public policy. They might do it earlier in their career, but they're not like MBAs. Executives come to business schools at fairly senior levels of their careers, and they do it repeatedly. So somehow I think we do have an impact. And I think we should believe in our teaching, we should believe in our research much more, because certainly the Saïd Business School, and it's most true of many business schools, I think, earn a large proportion of their revenues and the larger proportion of their profits through executive education, and executives are prepared to pay. We give them something, we should value ourselves. I'm not quite sure what it is. Dan might help me out on this thing. There's a bit of a mystery why anyone should pay to listen to me, but they do sometimes. Dan.
Well, from the practice point of view, so, I became head of strategy after starting my career in marketing. And then I worked in the mergers and acquisitions group. I ran the corporate finance group. I worked in innovations, and now I'm head of strategy. I don't know much about strategy at all. I mean, it's like, all right, now I'm running a discipline. It's like, I don't even know what that discipline is, which is totally different than any other function. All right. So if you're on track to be a chief financial officer, you start your career in finance and you work your way through finance and you're like exclusively focused on that discipline. That's true of most other disciplines inside companies. You're in marketing, you're in sales, you're in R&D, you're in manufacturing operations. Those tend to be, very more defined disciplines in the sense. Strategy is in part multidisciplined in itself. And so for my own career, the fact that I started in marketing and then I worked in M&A and then worked in finance formed the basis for an ability to see things from multiple lenses. And I think that's one of the critical things. In terms of the academic role, those of us in practice, you would be shocked at how little we know. Honest to goodness, which is why I pick up books and you go to courses and executives go to courses, because you're kind of on the firing line all the time and you're just trying to keep track of 10 balls that are in the air and trying to keep 3 from hitting you in the head. The pace is remarkably fast. You just don't have reflection time. One of the things that academics have that practitioners don't is the ability to reflect and think about things, and you have context, which practitioners don't. I mean, in any role, you're working in one company, and you just don't have a perspective on the discipline, and that's true of strategy too. I mean, and so one of the things I get from Richard and other people along the way, and executive education courses and all those things, is like, I don't have any context for how to think about this field as well. And academic research education can be a tremendous benefit to that in kind of coordinating different perspectives. Research can be incredibly valuable in pushing forward, because we're always looking for new ideas, right? Can you do something better along the way? But one of the things, now having been in a business school, I'm just a lecturer, so I'm not on the academic faculty, but it's kind of important from my lens, and Richard, I think, it's one of the areas that you're especially good at as well, is like, you need to do the proper academic research, so that things are valid, et cetera. But there's a need, from the practitioner point of view, there's a need to help guide me to, like, what am I supposed to do? Because those of us on the practice side aren't very good at taking the research and the conclusions from the research and figuring out, what do I do Monday morning? So if I think about where the big gap is, it's in the difference between the research practice and it's like, what am I supposed to do when I get to Monday morning? What change in the process do I make? What do I try? What are other people doing that's worked, which may or may not work in the cultural context? And when you get to executive education courses, and Richard, I'm interested in your experience, because in executive education, one of the things you really get as a teacher and a student is like, what do you do? I mean, there's an emphasis on like, how do you actually change practice? You run your executive education work differently than your in your other teaching?
Yeah, I don't do much MBA teaching. I love working with executives because I just get them to talk about their own businesses. And together, they know about their own businesses, but what they don't see is the similarities, the situations, and the lessons they can learn from others. So they learn from each other and they pay me. It's wonderful. I learn too. It's good. So I increasingly think we should have, it's a cliche, the flipped classroom, even in undergraduate teaching, an MBA teaching, is possible. But there's so much experience out there. What we do is we provide a context, and we provide perhaps a language and some analytical frameworks for people to understand the generality of their problems when they're absorbed in Clorox or PE's particular problems. Yeah. Is there a last question or two? I don't know whether we got time, Katerina.
Yeah, I was wondering about that too, but maybe we do a very quick last question and then we wrap it up. So there has been a discussion on the chat in terms of, because we're now broadening out, including more stakeholders, we're also tackling bigger issues, and whether there's a need to collaborate with other fields, information systems, political science, arts and humanities. And so there was a question, yeah, is there a need for that? What contributions can these other fields make? Etc.
Certainly we should be able to learn from politics, we should be able to learn from sociology. I've always been a little bit reserved about psychology, but I'm getting persuaded. I'm certainly astonished by the poor framing of the issues, which seem to have cultural but also psychological basis surrounding COVID early on. So yeah, we should be multidisciplinary. Information systems seems to me like a sub-discipline, a bit like strategy, which can draw upon many of the more foundational disciplines. It's not to put any ranking on the foundational disciplines, they're just broader. But yeah, certainly with the rise of open strategy and digital strategizing, we need to work, and we are, I think, working a lot more with the information systems people. We'll need to work with the organization design community and development and change community as well. And strategy for SAP, the strategy division, is still very important, and it does reach out to us from time to time, and we should grab their hands and welcome them on board. So yeah, just as business strategy is more and more collaborative, must our research be.
Richard, as I think about that from a practitioner lens, though, it's strategy is kind of by nature multidisciplinary, because in addition to developing the strategy and using all the tools from other academic disciplines to do that, you've actually got to execute it as well. So there's a change management element. I mean, there's a lot of human sides to this, in addition to the economics and competitive sides of this. And you need to take. So my view, which you may disagree with. You don't want to get too embedded in any single discipline, because the strategy role is more of one of connecting the dots across disciplines. Because the reality is no one else does that really well. I mean, finance people connect the dots across the economics of businesses, HR experts connect the dots across the people and operating, but the unique part of strategy is the ability to see the broader picture, to look much further out in time than most other disciplines look, and then to kind of, you know, be able to connect those dots in ways that others don't see. And so it's multidisciplinary kind of by its nature, but I worry a little bit about getting too, you know, too detailed in any individual discipline, because that's, the deeper you do that, the less, you know, the more you dive into the details, the less ability you're going to be able to connect the dots and see things across different functions. Does that make sense to you, or?
It does. I often say that the great thing about being a strategist is not being multidisciplinary, but ill-disciplined.
Mm-hmm.
Not respecting any boundaries, finding knowledge and insight and innovation wherever you can.
Great. I think this is a great concluding remark, and unfortunately I have to wrap up the session. I don't know, are there any final comments you want to make, Richard and Dan?
Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk. Wish I could be with you. I hope it's not going to be like this next year, but it's not too bad.
Yes, yes. So, well, we have, I just want to say we have a business meeting coming up in half an hour, and then a social meeting in an hour. I will post the links in the chat. So please join us for our business meeting, where we actually will also see a little bit of change in our membership and how they collaborate with other divisions. And then for the social, where we can maybe continue some of the conversations that we had here. So thank you, everybody. Thanks to the participants, and especially to Richard and Dan, of course.
Thank you. See you later at the social.
Yes.
I'll be there as well.
Great.
Okay then. Bye.
Bye.